Okay, welcome everybody. Good evening. We'll just give it a few seconds for people to join. Welcome everybody if you're just joining. Good evening, everybody. Just give it a few more seconds for people to trickle in. We've still got people joining now. Welcome everybody if you're just joining. Okay, just give it a few more seconds, then we'll get underway. Okay, let's get underway. All right, so welcome everybody. Welcome to this evening's Naturetrek online roadshow. My name is George Vincent. Many of you may know me from previous roadshows, perhaps, or from my work in the tailor-made department at Naturetrek. And I spend sort of the majority of my time based in our Hampshire office over in Chawton. In our tailor-made team, we sort of create bespoke holidays for people with more specific interests, or for those that would rather not travel as part of a group. And we cover a huge range of countries, just as the groups do. And my day-to-day work is particularly specialized now in Southeast Asia, but also parts of South America and a smattering of other countries too, including Ghana, where I've luckily just returned from being out in the field with one of our groups back in March. So I am lucky enough to get out and about now and then, co-leading trips. And some of you may have been lucky or perhaps unlucky enough to be in a group with me in the past. So welcome if that's the case. But I am delighted tonight to be joined by Ben Chapple. Ben is an ex-Naturetrek colleague who now works at the Zoological Society in London, and he's currently carrying out some PhD research looking at African wild dogs. And on the 29th of this month, Ben's actually going to be back with us going into more depth on that if you'd like to hear from him on that topic. You might recognize Ben from previous roadshows. He's helped us with quite a few now. He's very experienced in the field of conservation biology, and I think his expertise is really going to shine through tonight and really help to elevate the talks. So we are going to be covering quite a broad range of topics this evening, sort of stretching from pangolins and their ecology through conservation pressures, and then I'm going to take a bit more of an in-depth dive into Ghana. It's a bit of a case study and what that can offer us as wildlife enthusiasts. So we're sort of going to split the evening in two. So Ben's firstly going to tell us a little bit more about the ecology of pangolins, but also the pressures they're facing all over the world and the conservation measures being put in place to protect them. And then following on from that, I'll be taking you on a journey through the Upper Guinea rainforests of Ghana, touching on both pangolins, but also the marvelous Picathartes bird. And then talking a little bit about my experience in the country more generally, as well as its offerings as a wildlife destination. As usual, as we go through the talks, if you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A section, and we should have some time at the end to come to those and answer them in person. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Ben to get us underway. So Ben, please, welcome.
Thanks very much, George. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. So as George mentioned, let's just see, there we go. So as George mentioned, I'm going to start by taking you through some information about pangolins in general, some aspects of their ecology and behavior, distribution, a little bit about where you can try and see them, especially if you want to give George and the rest of the tailor-made department a bit of a challenge. And then we're going to talk about some of the threats to pangolins in the wild, and then what's being done, including by work some of my colleagues are doing at ZSL to try and save them. So to start off with, what is a pangolin? Well, they are sometimes known as scaly anteaters. These are the world's only mammals that have scales rather than fur. Those scales are made of a substance called keratin, which is the same substance in human hair and fingernails, and poignantly, given the pangolin's prominence in the illegal wildlife trade, it's the same substance as rhino horn. Now, sadly, as I've just alluded to, they are most famous for being the world's most trafficked wild mammal, besides humans. Now, I'm going to talk, as I said, in a little more detail about the threats to pangolins and their illegal trading a bit later. But I think it's an absolute tragedy that these extraordinary, bizarre animals are best known for being so endangered. They're best known for their threats, the threats to them. And there is so much more to them than that. I mean, I'm going to start this evening by speaking about what makes them so fascinating in their own right. Now, the name pangolin comes from an old Malay word, penguling, which means roller or one who rolls up. And this, of course, is a reference to their extraordinary defensive capacity for rolling up into a tight ball to protect themselves from predators. Now, this can be incredibly effective. I've seen reports of whole prides of lions collectively trying to prise open a rolled up pangolin without any success. So this really is an effective anti-predator strategy. Now, biologically speaking, pangolins are members of the family Manidae, and collectively they represent the only living members of a whole biological order, the order Pholidota. Now, although pangolins appear to share several physical and behavioral traits with the group of mammals called the Xenarthra, that's the group of South American mammals that includes things like sloths, anteaters, and armadillos. And in fact, if you look at, say, a tamandua, these arboreal anteaters that live in Central and South America, pangolins actually very closely resemble them. But despite this, they're most closely related, as I said, to the order Carnivora, which is the order of mammals that includes things like cats, dogs, seals, bears, all sorts of things like that. Although they did diverge from the Carnivora about 80 million years ago. If I had to guess, I would imagine that the common ancestor of these two groups was probably a small insect-eating arboreal hunter. Now, as this chart suggests, there are 8 species of pangolin recognized today, 4 of which are found in Asia and 4 in Africa. The Asian species can be distinguished from the African ones in part by the fact they have hairs growing up from between the scales, these little bristles. I'm going to go into a bit more detail into each of these species in a few minutes. But first, I want to talk about a really intriguing discovery, or potential discovery, that's happened in the last few years. So the DNA sequencing of confiscated pangolin scales across Asia is often used to try and trace where these legally poached animals have come from. Now, in 2012 and 2013, 2 samples from Hong Kong were identified that didn't correspond to any known pangolin species. And in fact, this was later corroborated by further samples that suggest there is a 9th pangolin species out there somewhere that probably diverged from 2 of the known Asian species of pangolin about 5 million years ago. We have no idea where it is. So it's a bit of a race against time to find it, if these results are correct, before it becomes extinct. And it seems most likely that this population, wherever it is, corresponds to some isolated Southeast Asian island, or perhaps a mountain range somewhere on mainland Asia. Now, for now, I'm going to talk about the pangolin species we do know something about. They are all highly specialized insectivores, the African species in particular, but possibly the Asian species as well, no one's quite sure, exclusively eat ants and termites, and often just a few very specific species. Some estimates suggest that a single individual pangolin can consume as many as 70 million individual insects in a given year. So they therefore have a really important pest control function in the ecosystems they inhabit. And this highly specialized diet makes them really difficult to look after in captivity, and they often reject unfamiliar insect species that are tried to be fed to them, or they become ill when they're fed foreign food. And sometimes it's completely impossible to rear pangolins in captivity. I remember watching actually a documentary a few years ago about a rehabilitation facility in Namibia that looks after living confiscated pangolins. And the only way that they could feed these rescued animals was to walk each individual for up to 6 hours a day so they could find their own food. And that's pretty dedicated conservation attention. Now, they have several superb adaptations for their diet. Most species have these really strong front claws that you can see here in this picture. These are adaptations for digging into termite nests. They have quite poor vision, so they locate their food through a powerful sense of smell. They have this small conical head and jaws that completely lack any teeth. They also have special muscles that seal their nostrils and keep their ears shut, and that protect them from the bites of the insects they're trying to feed upon. But perhaps the most extraordinary thing that they have for feeding on these ants and termites is that incredibly long, muscular, sticky tongue that you can see in this picture. That helps them lap up insects from well within deep cavities inside termite and ant nests. Now, the tongue is actually as long often as the head and body combined, and that's so long, in fact, that finding somewhere to put it required a bit of evolutionary improvisation, as I think you can see in this picture. So the tongue is so long that it has to be retracted into a special sheath called the xiphisternum, which extends all the way to the pelvis. So as you can see in this picture here, the attachment point for the tongue is actually right the way down by the animal's hips. And this is, in fact, quite a common problem that species that have these very long tongues for feeding on insects have to face. And I thought I would very briefly show you a picture of a more familiar species, perhaps, than the pangolin, and how it has come up with a solution to this problem. And that's the green woodpecker, which I'm sure will be familiar to many of you from your gardens. They also have an extremely long tongue, but the solution they've come up with, quite different to the pangolin, is to allow it to loop all the way around the back of the head and attach right up at the base of the bill. So, bizarre, but very different solutions to where to store this enormous appendage. Now, the first of the 8 species that I want to talk about this evening might be the most familiar of all the 8. And this is largely because the habitat it occupies overlaps extensively with some of the most visited wildlife tourism destinations in the world. It's found in many of the classic African safari destinations. And unlike the other pangolin species, the other 7, its preference is for wooded savanna, sometimes quite open and sparse environments. Now, this is the second largest of all pangolins. It can weigh up to 19 kilograms with a length of 1.2 meters. It's classed as vulnerable by the IUCN. This is still, a relatively high level of extinction threat relative to most species, but compared with other pangolins, it's doing relatively well. That's not to say it's easy to see. It's still vanishingly rare and difficult to come across. This is its geographical range. It has the widest range of any pangolin species, found from northern South Africa all the way up through East Africa and towards southern Chad. This encompasses some really dry habitats, including parts of the Kalahari Desert. These are actually where a lot of our best knowledge about pangolins comes. Tracking them is much easier in sandy environments because they leave a very distinctive trail with their tail through the sand. And this enables biologists to track them down and pin tracking devices on them, which are by far the best way we can learn about pangolin ecology. Now, as I said, it's probably the best known species of pangolin, and there are several long-term studies that are going on. They exclusively eat ants and termites, like all other African species. They're also entirely terrestrial, which means they spend their entire lives on the ground. An adaptation to this is the fact that they are bipedal, so they only ever walk on their hind legs, and they use those big foreclaws and their very long tail as a sort of balance as they walk along. Now, like most pangolins, they're predominantly nocturnal, and they rest in burrows during the day, which they don't dig themselves. They actually tend to take over the burrows of other animals like aardvark and porcupine spring hare that those species have abandoned. They also use those burrows for feeding. Females give birth to a single pup that remains in the natal burrow for up to a month. After that point, the baby can move around on the mother's back, leading to one of what I think is one of the most adorable sights in the whole of nature. After about 3 months, the baby will reach independence, although they can remain in their mother's territory for up to a year. Now, this is my own picture of a ground pangolin. I'm sorry if it's not quite as good as some of the ones that I've just shown you. I actually, if I had my wits about me, could have got a much better one. But by the time I picked my jaw up from the floor, this animal had already moved quite some distance away. It's one of the highlights of my wildlife career, encountering this animal. I was very lucky to do so in the Kruger National Park in South Africa. Now, I should just caveat what I'm about to say about this and all the other species by saying that there are very few good places to see pangolins of any species. The information I'm providing here is really for dedicated wildlife watchers who are, like me, slightly obsessed with pangolins and the idea of trying to see as many of them as possible. Now, one place where you do have a very good chance is Swalu Kalahari Game Reserve in South Africa. This is unfortunately extremely expensive, but there is a project there that tags them, that gives a decent chance of success. There are also tagged pangolins in Namibia at a couple of different reserves, Irindi and Okanjima. These are less expensive to visit, but probably offer not quite as good a chance as Swalu. Now, the second species I want to talk about is the giant pangolin. This is most closely related to the ground pangolin that I've just discussed. It's the largest of all pangolins, reaching up to 33 kilograms, the size of a sort of average black Labrador, although more closely resembles a wheelbarrow as far as I'm concerned. This is listed as endangered by the IUCN. It's very, very, very hard to see. They can dig burrows up to 40 meters long, and the chambers at the end of them can be so large that a grown adult human can stand up and walk around in them. It's really extraordinary. This is their distribution. We know very little about the species, but it's actually distributed through the forests of Western Central Africa. It's nocturnal and also spends all its life on the ground. It lives in forest and forest savanna mosaics, marginally entering East Africa, including the Nyakweri forest in Western Kenya, which is actually on the border of the Masai Mara. Very few people know that there are giant pangolins in that part of the world. Now, again, this is, as I said, probably one of the most difficult pangolins to see. If you can get to Gabon, that's the only place I know where there's a vaguely realistic chance. There are some long-term research projects going on there with tagged individuals, which if you can participate in those, offer a chance of success. They are very occasionally seen on night drives in Uganda in Queen Elizabeth National Park. And as I mentioned, Western Kenya, Nyakweri Forest, there is a bit of a chance there. I have tried myself in the past without success. But if you've got a thermal scope and you're happy to wander around for hours and hours and hours in the dark, who knows, you might get lucky. Now, the third African species is this is white-bellied pangolin. This is a small arboreal pangolin, which has the alternative name of tree pangolin. Now, this is the most frequently encountered of all 8 pangolin species. It's about 60 to 100 centimeters in length, with the tail making up about half its body length. They weigh a maximum of about 3 kilograms, so just 10% of the size of a giant pangolin. They're almost exclusively nocturnal, again, eating only ants and termites. Although they are perhaps the most behaviorally flexible of all the African species. So they are able to forage both on the ground and in trees. And this flexibility is probably partly responsible for the species' relative adaptability. Of all African pangolins, it's the most likely to do well in human-modified landscapes. So it can be quite numerous in these degraded so-called farm bush landscapes, for example, as long as poaching pressure, of course, is relatively low. Quite wide distribution across tropical Western Central Africa, widespread in Western Central, but marginally entering Eastern or Western Kenya, like giant pangolin. Kakamega Forest again is a place that you can try, but really the best places to see it are all in West Africa largely. Obviously, George is going to talk a bit about Ghana later, but Cameroon and Sierra Leone, big protected areas there, offer a realistic chance, as does Jangasanga National Park in the Central African Republic. Kakamega, I'm not really sure how good a chance there is. Very sadly, when I tried a few months ago, the local authorities didn't take too kindly to the idea of me wandering around at night on my own, brandishing a torch and a thermal scope, and they effectively locked me in my lodge for my own safety, which did not make me very pleased. But I may try and go back there next time I'm in Kenya. Now, this is the black-bellied pangolin. This is the fourth and final African species. This is surely the most beautiful of all pangolins. I mean, just look at those golden scales and the contrast with that jet black fur on the face and the belly. The tail can be twice the length of the body, so that leads to its alternative name of long-tailed pangolin. And the tail is also prehensile, so it essentially provides an extra limb that helps this animal clamber through the trees. It's also the smallest of all the pangolin species, usually weighing just 1 or 2 kilograms. Relatively similar distribution to giant and white-bellied pangolin, although it's more patchily distributed across Western Central Africa. It's the most habitat-specific African pangolin. It's most often found in riverine and swamp forests, usually very close to water. Otherwise, very little is known about its ecology. It's generally rare and extremely difficult to see in the wild. What we do know is that it is virtually entirely arboreal, and in contrast to other pangolin species, it's principally diurnal. So it often ascends to the top of the canopy in the early morning to bask in the sun before descending to lower levels later on in the day. And this can provide opportunities to come across it, especially if you're out birding in a forest in Ghana or somewhere similar. Now, as it's principally diurnal, most of its major predators are visual hunters like birds of prey. This species actually relies less on curling up into a ball than its relatives, and more on its ability to freeze perfectly still in the canopy. Now, this can be very effective if an eagle or some other bird of prey is passing overhead, but it can sadly leave it quite vulnerable to poachers, who often don't struggle once they've spotted it to climb up the tree and pluck it off exposed branches. Now, where can you see it? Again, like white-bellied, Ghana is probably the best place to try. George will talk more about this later. Kakum National Park has a gorgeous canopy walkway that early in the morning can be a productive spot for this species. I was lucky enough to see it in this same national park, but about 11 a.m. lower down in the canopy while we were actually looking for bulbuls, very brown, boring birds. There's also a good chance in CAR, in Jangasanga National Park, where there's a rehabilitation program. Now, generally speaking, we know much less about the Asian pangolins, so these will be quicker to get through. They're generally much rarer and harder to see than their African counterparts. The Chinese pangolin is largely fossorial, which means it's adapted to burrowing rather than feeding in trees. It has this distinctive helmeted appearance. Now, as their distribution is slightly more in temperate areas than a lot of other pangolins, they actually spend most of the winter concealed in burrows, which they dig close to termite colonies, which provide a steady source of food. Now, as you can see, most of its distribution is within China, as you might expect, but sadly for a species where illegal demand for its products largely comes from China, you can imagine what the status of this animal is across most of its distribution. Now, where can you see it? I mean, mostly you can't. It's very, very hard. Taiwan, although, interestingly, is a bit of a stronghold. This is in sharp contrast to a few decades ago, where some estimates suggested that 60,000 pangolins a year were being taken out of Taiwan for their hides and scales. But since the 1970s, they've been quite strictly and effectively protected. And now parts of Taiwan have what are thought to be the highest pangolin densities anywhere in the world, up to 12 per square kilometre in the Luanshan region of the southeast. And they seem to be quite frequently encountered by locals. I've seen videos of them wandering through university campuses, wandering around suburban gardens, even the grounds of Taipei Zoo on the outskirts of the capital city. And interestingly, these areas where they're doing really well don't seem to coincide at all with the areas that most birders or other wildlife visitors go when they visit Taiwan. They seem to like these more farmed areas that are actually quite bad for other mammals, and especially for the endemic birds that draw a lot of visitors to Taiwan. And I haven't managed to go there myself yet, but my hunch is that Taiwan, with the right approach, could be the best place to see pangolins anywhere in the world. Although if you are going to go, probably best to make it soon with all the political uncertainty that surrounds Taiwan at the moment. A couple of other places where there's a chance: Nepal, particularly Chitwan National Park, and northeast India around Arunachal Pradesh. There are occasional reports of Chinese pangolin from there. Sunda pangolin is the most widely distributed of the Asian pangolins. It's also the most commonly found in the illicit wildlife market. It's a principally arboreal species, and that's about all I can really tell you about it, to be honest. Where to see it, the only realistic place where there's, I think, a fair number of reports are actually these pockets of forest that you can get in Singapore. There's also a small chance of sightings on tours to Borneo that principally target nocturnal mammals. Philippine pangolin is the third Asian species, again, very, very poorly known, and in fact only recently described as distinct from the Sunda pangolin. Also principally arboreal, but besides that, we really don't know. It's found mostly on the island of Palawan and a few neighboring islands in the southern part of the Philippines. And really, there are no good locations that are known for trying to find it in the wild. Finally, through these species accounts, is the Indian pangolin. This is the least threatened of all the Asian species. It's merely listed as endangered rather than critically endangered. Like the Chinese pangolin, it's principally terrestrial or fossorial, but there's some flexibility. It's thought that Indian pangolins in some parts of Sri Lanka actually mostly feed in a canopy, which is an interesting behavioral adaptation. It's the most westernly distributed of the Asian pangolins, reaching 2 separate regions of Pakistan. And again, so only Sri Lanka offers a realistic chance of seeing this in the wild. And by realistic, I mean it's not completely impossible. Mainland India, it's sometimes seen in Gir National Park in Western India. I also remember Andy Tucker, who's the managing director at Naturetrek, saw one in Kanha National Park in central India. Although this was such an extraordinarily rare occurrence that when I visited Kanha a year later, the guides were still talking about how extraordinary it was that this British tourist had seen pangolins. Now, moving on to the threats to pangolins, of course, habitat loss is an issue. There are very few species around the world for which habitat loss is not a problem. This is particularly acute in Southeast Asia, where I'm sure you're all well aware there's been an enormous amount of forest clearance. But the main cause of pangolin decline is, of course, poaching for its meat and scales, and this is driven particularly by demand from China and Vietnam. Pangolins are the most illegally trafficked mammal in the world, besides humans, as I've mentioned. And pangolin meat is consumed as a sign of status in upmarket restaurants. The scales are also used as part of traditional Chinese medicine to treat a wide range of ailments, basically everything you can think of, cancer to a cold. There's no scientific evidence that this actually works. As I've said before, the scales are made from the same stuff as fingernails. And pangolin consumption is actually legal in China under established traditional Chinese medicine. What's an interesting situation is that it's claimed that most of the pangolins that are consumed come from legal farming operations. But a colleague of mine at ZSL has done some really interesting digging and has demonstrated that it's impossible for the capacity of captive breeding to meet the scale of consumption. So actually, this is just a story that the Chinese government are telling in order to paper over the illegality of what's really going on. Now, more than 1 million pangolins are estimated to have been taken from the wild since the year 2000. The 4 Asian species are the ones that have taken the biggest hit, but the impact is global. And as the populations of Asian species have crashed, traffickers have increasingly targeted African species. So there's been a massive spike in the rate of poaching of African pangolins. And for example, in 2021, a shipment of 17 tons of pangolin scales, representing perhaps 40,000 individuals, was intercepted in Nigeria. And it's estimated that maybe 400,000 pangolins a year in total are taken out of African forests. And then, yeah, so as I'll talk about later, we simply also don't know how many wild pangolins are out there, which really impacts their conservation. African species aren't just threatened by illegal trade to Asia. There has also always been a traditional level of consumption for the bushmeat trade. Their scales do also have some cultural value to a lot of African societies. But in the past, this bushmeat consumption was never on a commercial scale. But now that's starting to change. There's increasing demand from wealthy Africans in cities for pangolin products. Now, what can be done? It seems to me that there are 4 main things that conservationists can do to try and improve the situation for pangolins. The first is better population and distribution knowledge. It's very difficult to conserve something when you simply don't know where it is and how many of them there are. And there's an irony that's often present with illegal trade in wildlife. that the poachers often tend to have much better information on the distribution of these species than any conservationists. These poachers are very, very well resourced, very well financed, often have a very high level of expertise. Now, a good example of this in action is ZSL's work in the Philippines, where, again, we really know very little about the current state of Philippine pangolin. The first step that the team out there took was to conduct a local ecological knowledge survey across the entire island of Palawan, which helped to provide a picture of the distribution. That information helped to identify potential hotspots for pangolin conservation. And this picture on the right was the first camera trap image that was secured of a pangolin in an area that had been identified as a probable priority area for protection. And the team is working at the moment on trying to get that gazetted as a national park. Community-led conservation is also a key pillar. One example is a couple of community-managed reserves that ZSL has helped to establish in Nepal. One thing that's really important to remember is that the people who are actually doing the poaching are arguably the least morally at fault of anyone involved in the illegal pangolin trade. They're often doing it because they simply have no other way of making a sustainable living. So by providing alternative career opportunities for local people, working with them to understand their needs and why it is that some of them resort to illegal wildlife poaching, we can dramatically reduce the rate at which pangolins are taken from certain areas. And George will talk, I think, a bit about the Picathartes forest in Ghana, which is a really good example as well of this community-led conservation in action. Now, improved enforcement is also really important. ZSL is very active in training rangers, lawyers, and law enforcement officers on how to better detect illegal wildlife crime, and then how to improve the probability that those arrests actually lead to successful prosecutions. This has led to a big spike in the seizure of illegal deliveries of pangolin scales in countries like Nigeria. Ultimately, though, I think what needs to happen is there has to be a sea change in the way we approach this kind of trade. And the global illegal wildlife trade is huge business. It's often associated with organized crime. It's estimated to reach the value of perhaps $23 billion a year. This is a huge international money laundering issue, not just an issue of wildlife conservation. Wildlife crime is often not taken particularly seriously in and of itself by officials. And the prosecutions of people involved in it are mostly secured by proving possession of illegal wildlife products. But these are crimes that often don't have strong penalties attached to them. It might be a fine or, at worst, a short prison sentence, which makes it a relatively low-risk activity for perpetrators, especially given how incredibly profitable it is an activity. And I would argue that recognizing the illegal wildlife trade for what it is serious international organized crime of a similar nature to drug trafficking, could lead to more effective enforcement. And this is on a slight side note. This is one of two dogs that was trained by the Metropolitan Police in concert with ZSL, which was then sent out to Thailand to help with the detection of illegal wildlife shipments. Now, finally, the last thing is tackling the demand. And ultimately, I think successful pangolin conservation has to rely on reducing demand for their products. As long as people still want to consume pangolin products, traffickers will surely find a way to cater to that demand. You just have to think of how prevalent illegal drugs are, despite the massive amounts of money and the massive amounts of political attention that have been dedicated to stopping the drug trade. Pangolin trafficking hasn't received anything like that level of attention, so it seems unrealistic to think that if it did, there would be any realistic way of stopping it, as long as people still want to consume these products. Sadly, it's very hard to reduce demand, though, because many of the reasons why people want to consume pangolin products are actually deeply embedded in their culture and have a long history. So any approach that tries to reduce demand has to be evidence-based and culturally appropriate. So it has to be led by people who understand the culture of consumption of pangolin products. An outsider-led approach by people who don't understand the system is never likely to be successful, and can often come across as patronizing. And something that a ZSL colleague of mine has been doing in China is trying to emphasize the historical cultural importance of pangolins across Chinese rural societies. And then also another approach that's been taken are these celebrity-led campaigns, including by people like Jackie Chan, but also in Nigeria by celebrities like the former Arsenal footballer Alex Iwobi. Now, so Nigeria, for example, is actually thought that more than 50% of all wild trafficked pangolins pass through Nigeria now. And again, there's some evidence that these kind of campaigns can work. Previous celebrity-led campaigns have been associated with a reduction in demand for products like rhino horn and shark fin soup. So there are reasons, I think, to believe that pangolins can be saved. We just have to hope that we can do it before they disappear. And on that note, I will say thank you, and I will pass over to George.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was absolutely excellent. Fascinating stuff. I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. And yeah, as you rightly say, it's incredibly sad. But yeah, absolutely. There's things we can do. And of course, thankfully, still places where some of these fabulous creatures can still be seen. So without further ado, I will now talk a little bit about Ghana. This is going to be a bit of a hybrid talk. So I'm going to touch upon pangolins and Picathartes as well. Just a quick side note on Picathartes. When I say Picathartes, I'm referring to this bird in the middle here. We call it, or have historically called it, a yellow-headed Picathartes. It's also quite frequently known as white-necked rockfowl. So it was originally called Picathartes because that's the Latin genus Picathartes. So if you hear me referring to a Picathartes or a rockfowl throughout this talk, I'm referring to this bird in particular. Okay, so for those of you that aren't sure, where is Ghana? As Ben sort of touched upon, it's over in West Africa, right here on the coast, sandwiched between the Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso to the north, Togo over to the east, and then the Gulf of Guinea to the south. And it's a really diverse landscape that contrasts from savanna, arid savanna up in the north, right the way through the coastal plain and into dense tropical Upper Guinea rainforest. And when I say Upper Guinea, if I just flip over to the satellite view here, I'm talking about this area of the map just here. This is what we call the Upper Guinea region. It's a biodiverse geographical and ecological zone that extends along the Atlantic coast from the edge of Guinea-Bissau right through Guinea, across Sierra Leone, Liberia, the bottom of the Ivory Coast, and then into Ghana, a little bit of Togo as well. So this represents the easternmost extent of Africa's vast tropical rainforest belt, but it is distinct. It's separate from the forests of the Congo and Gabon down here. So because of that, it's home to a unique array of species which aren't found elsewhere. I think this map is a nice way to display exactly where this forest is. So this really nicely shows the extent of the forest, and we're going to be talking about this sector here in Ghana. So like any tropical forest, it's incredibly dense. If you spend any time in rainforest habitat, yeah, it's hot, it's steamy, but it's absolutely packed full of biodiversity. And in this area, in the Upper Guinea, as I say, you find species which aren't found necessarily in the rest of tropical Africa, including the white-necked rockfowl or the yellow-headed Picathartes. But this area is also a significant stronghold for two of the species that Ben has talked about, both white-bellied and black-bellied pangolin. So that's the tree pangolin or long-tailed pangolin. Giant pangolin is in range in Ghana, but it has almost never been seen. When I was out there, I spoke to several guides who have worked in Ghana, lived in Ghana all their life and never seen it, not once. So it is very difficult to see. So when we're talking about pangolins in Ghana, we're talking about white-bellied and black-bellied pangolins. But why Ghana? Because I showed that there are several countries that the Upper Guinea rainforest encompasses. So why do we pick Ghana in particular? Well, primarily is the stability. And by stability, I mean both political and economic. It's a bit of a beacon of stability in what's historically been quite a troubled region. But Ghana's been safe to visit for many, many years, and it's not experienced nearly the same level of political unrest as some of its surrounding nations. The local population is incredibly friendly. And as a bit of a bonus, they are English speaking. It's an English speaking nation. A quick history lesson for those of you that aren't aware. Ghana is an ex-British colony, and it was actually granted independence from Britain back in 1957, which meant it became the first country in sub-Saharan Africa to gain independence from European colonial rule. And they're very proud of that, but they are also actually, in some respects, equally proud of some of their British heritage. So they've retained English as the official language, and it is widely spoken, even though local dialects are spoken all over the country. It is very nice that not only are your guides trained in English as their first language, but also, your local drivers and restaurant staff. They all speak English. So it's really nice. You can understand them, they can understand you. And it just makes the whole visit a little bit more pleasant. And today, Ghana and the UK maintain a lot of economic ties, including work and, of course, tourism, which is obviously one of the reasons that so many people visit. Tied into that a little bit is the excellent network of local naturalist guides we have in Ghana. So in this wider region, it's not the same as East Africa. Coming across guides of a high standard in West Africa is quite difficult. But in Ghana, it's a bit of an anomaly in that we have a huge range of really talented local guides, and they are specialized in various aspects of natural history. So we have expert birding guides, but also guides that are really good at identifying mammals in the field, and even butterfly specialists. In fact, my colleague Barney, who is our operations manager for our Ghana group tours, has just launched this week a brand new butterfly-focused tour to Ghana, which if that's your thing, I'd certainly go and have a look at that. It should be on the website now. It should be a fantastic trip. So Ghana itself is a hugely varied habitat, as I say, and it's got a very good network of protected areas. So that broad range of habitat, coming from tropical forest to dry savanna, means that there are a huge number of species that you can sort of encounter within a relatively short period of time. Not only that, but the infrastructure is good enough to mean that we can put these places together into a workable itinerary. And one of the best things about Ghana is that not only are there protected areas that exist, but they are accessible in that you can stay either in or near them in relatively reasonable accommodation, which is not such a luxury, again, in some of the surrounding nations like Sierra Leone and Cameroon, where similar wildlife exists. There just isn't the infrastructure to stay or visit. So that's another huge bonus, another reason for visiting Ghana as well. And just to top it all off, British Airways run daily direct flights from London Heathrow. Takes about 6 or 7 hours, so it's really accessible as well. Ghana is very well known to be a fabulous country for birding in general. It's very famous amongst the birding community, particularly for things like bee eaters. There's more than 10 species of bee eater in Ghana, and it's not unusual to see that many species in a single trip, including things that like blue mustache bee eater and black bee eater. Unfortunately, I don't have photos of some of those species that are more forest dwelling, but it's the same story for the kingfishers. Again, 10 plus species of kingfisher, and again, rarities like chocolate-backed kingfisher and white-bellied kingfisher, some really fabulous birds. To stick with the 10 plus species of hornbill as well. So you're ranging from the tropical forest western long-tailed hornbill, the huge brown-cheeked and black-cast hornbill that inhabit the canopy of the primary forest, through to things like Abyssinian ground hornbill, which inhabit the dry savannas, and then these African grey hornbill as well, which are kind of more scrubland based birds. And then sunbirds, there's more than 20 species of sunbird. And it's not unusual to see 4 or 5 different species of sunbird in a single day. And it can get quite a challenge, really, actually, to pick between the flashes of colors as they move through the trees, trying to sort out which species is which, particularly when we look at the females, who are not quite as colorful as the males as well. But perhaps the most famous of birds in Ghana is almost certainly the white-necked rockfowl, or the yellow-headed Picathartes. As I say, the Picathartes is the name we get from the genus Picathartes. A bit of an interesting fact about this bird that not so many people know. is that Sir David Attenborough actually has a lot to thank this particular species for. So it was back in 1954, and Attenborough was working as a producer on the BBC's brand new program ZooQuest. And he befriended a zoologist called Jack Lester. He was on a mission to visit Sierra Leone with a camera crew to film them collecting a Picathartes for the London Zoo. And Attenborough was asked to go with them as a producer. But unfortunately, Jack Lester became very ill, and David Attenborough had to step in to cover for him. And that inadvertently kicked off a lifelong career in front of the camera. So it was that sort of happy, unhappy coincidence that led David Attenborough to be such a well-known household name and such a loved character as he is today. So although these birds are spread throughout the Upper Guinea rainforest, they are incredibly shy, and you're very unlikely to just bump into them as you're walking through the forest. So really the most reliable way to see them is to visit a known nesting site. Now, there is probably the most well-known nesting site is in Ghana, and it's over in a small village called Bonkro in south-central Ghana. And here, the local community has built simple tourist accommodation, simple but comfortable, and they've used the funds that they've generated from tourism to build this accommodation. But not only that, through our local partners, we've established a community fund, which has allowed them to actually build an entire primary school from the funds generated by people coming to see the Picathartes, which is absolutely fantastic. And as Ben said earlier, this is a real, this is the way forwards for ecotourism. It's the reciprocal benefits are huge when you show the local community the positive outcomes of ecotourism. You can see they absolutely relish in it. So this money that's been directly injected to the community, and it's absolutely fabulous. Every time we drive past in our bus on the way to and from the forest, the children are all smiling and beaming and just genuinely really happy to see us, and it's wonderful to see. It really is. But what they're protecting is a forest, which we sort of colloquially call Picathartes forest. It's a forest that borders the village of Bonkro. And it's important to note that this isn't a formally gazetted area. So this is actually a community forest. It's not a national park. So it has no formal protection. Making sure the communities are on side is absolutely vital, because it's the only thing that's stopping people from coming in and felling trees and poaching animals. So it's amazing to see that the socioeconomic benefits have been realized here, and the local people are completely on side. And there's been a dramatic reduction in tree felling, and the populations of the Picathartes are happily increasing year on year, which is really nice to see. In fact, our local partners now sponsor 24 individual community members who help to protect the forest. And they become sort of advocates for it in their own right. And, word spreads among the village, and it's a real positive cycle. So there are around 13 different nesting sites within this forest, two of which are fairly regularly visited, one of which in particular we most often visit, simply because it's the easiest to get to. Depending on your fitness, it's around a 45-minute walk from the village, and you go up through the forest and it starts to get gradually more dense. And then there's a short uphill section, and then we'll wait on wooden benches, which have been specially set up facing this rock face, and wait sort of for the birds to come back after a day's feeding. They are absolutely bizarre birds. They like to forage on the ground for insects. They're active during the daytime, sleeping in these nests at nighttime. And they very rarely fly. They sort of hop around and do awkward hops and jumps and short bursts of wing bursts to get between locations and boulders. And it's very bizarre to watch. And if you're quiet and patient and you sit very still, they can become very inquisitive as well once they become comfortable with you. And for some groups, it's literally possible to get within a meter or so of them, and they'll just approach you. It is a real fabulous experience. And like Ben, I'm lucky enough to have had many fantastic wildlife experiences in my lifetime, but this was really up there as one of the special ones. It really was a special experience. The nests themselves are built out of mud and plant fiber. So they use spittle to sort of build these nests on the edge of the rock face. And quite a few birds can nest together in one place. But as we have been discussing this evening, it's not only the Picathartes that inhabit this forest. Thanks to that community support that's really helped protect the forest, this place is now an excellent place to find two species, white-bellied and black-bellied pangolins, particularly the white-bellied pangolins in this particular forest. As we say, pangolins are not easy to see all over the world. If you're going to try, this is the place to do it. And whenever we go into the forest, we enlist the help of several local guides who are absolute experts at locating them. In the past, perhaps they would have used these skills to hunt pangolins for sustenance or to sell, but now they've realized that it's much better to show them to people, to take pictures. So it's absolutely fantastic to see these pangolins in the wild, and we actually have a pretty good record now in this particular forest with that local help. This one was this little chappie we found on our last trip. He was about 7 meters up a tree, feasting on red forester ants, and he really only turned around for a couple of moments and before putting his head back down and continuing to gorge on his meal. I do apologize again for the quality of the photo. In my defense, this was taken on my iPhone through my binoculars while I was holding my torch in my mouth. So I think on balance, actually, I can say I've done an okay job here. But yeah, so it's a great place to find, particularly this species. But if you'd like to try for pangolins in Ghana, I'd highly recommend trying in Kakum as well, which Ben has already alluded to. Kakum is perhaps Ghana's most famous national park. And once again, near to the park, we've got some really nice accommodation, comfortable, air-conditioned, ensuite. It's about 10 minutes drive from the national park itself. And this park is particularly famous for this canopy walkway, which you can see I am located in today. No, I'm not really. I'm in Southampton, but I like to feel like I'm in the canopy walkway. It's a series of interconnected platforms about 40 meters above the forest floor. So you really are right up there in the canopy. And each of these platforms is large enough to take a birding telescope. So it's a really good place for birding, particularly for some of those larger hornbill species, which I mentioned. So they are not necessarily going to come down to ground level. So when you're birding from the ground, you can see them flying over, but it's only really when you get up eye level where you can get some really nice scope views of them. But as you know, continuing with the theme of this evening, one of the main reasons for many people going to Kakum is to see pangolins, particularly black-bellied or long-tailed pangolins. As Ben mentioned earlier, these black-bellied pangolins are diurnal, so they come out in the daytime. And funnily enough, they actually seem to be quite late risers. You usually imagine diurnal animals, mammals in particular, being dawn and dusk most active, but these guys tend to be kind of coming out at 9:30 a.m., something like that, just as the birding's quieting down. And then they'll stay around for an hour or so and then disappear back under the canopy. So yeah, as Ben says, they're far from guaranteed, but there's a reasonable chance if you spend enough time in the area, there's always a chance to see these guys. It's also another, it's a good location for other mammals as well. So there are an absolutely fabulous array of squirrels in Ghana, a hugely diverse group of mammals, sort of 6 or 7 species possible from the walkway, and a number of diurnal primates as well, sort of 3 species fairly regularly seen, and you could get 4 species maybe if you're very lucky, but certainly 2 or 3 species possible from the canopy walkway. And as I mentioned, an impressive array of hornbills, turacos, and other lovely birds like that. Not only mammals and birds, though, of course, I did mention earlier about the butterflies and this rainforest belt in Ghana. That's not just the rainforest belt, it's the dry areas too, but it's absolutely fabulous for butterflies. More than 1,000 species, I believe, now recorded in Ghana. And as I mentioned, we have just launched a entirely butterfly-focused tour to Ghana. So if you would like more information about that, please do have a look at the website or feel free to drop us an email or call into the office. And yeah, we'd be more happy to give you some more information about that tour. But even if butterflies aren't necessarily your thing, you can't help but notice them. They are absolutely everywhere and spectacularly beautiful, which is, yeah, it's always nice to see, especially because they tend to be a little bit more active again in the quieter times of birding. So 10, 11 a.m. when the activity dies down, the butterflies come out. So it makes for kind of a rounded morning of birding and wildlife watching. So yeah, it's a nice complement. But it's not just butterflies. There are lots of other cool invertebrates like this African millipede we found. I really like this shot. They're fabulous little critters. Yeah, there's lots and lots to see. Reptiles as well. So the final kind of rainforesty reserve I'd recommend considering is Ankasa Game Reserve, right over here on the border of Ivory Coast. This is probably Ghana's last remaining properly pristine, or should I say most accessible properly pristine rainforest, which means it is home still to some species which are now quite difficult to see elsewhere, particularly some of the more skulky birds and rainforest mammals as well. Once again, the accommodation here is more than comfortable. Our local partners have just built these brand new villa cabana type houses, which overlook the forest with a private balcony, private ensuite, air-conditioned rooms. It's a lovely place to stay. And because you're a stone's throw, literally a stone's throw, maybe 20 meters, 30 meters from the park entrance, there's plenty of wildlife, particularly birds, to see in the grounds as well. Things like black bee-eater, and this shot was actually taken as I was having breakfast. And I just think it's my new favorite bee-eater species. When you see black bee-eater written down on the checklist, you think, oh, well, that sounds pretty boring, but I don't really think the name does it justice. It's a spectacularly beautiful bird with this electric blue patterning and a bright red throat. It's a stunning bird. But there are other birds around as well. Of course, I mentioned the sunbirds, some really spectacular birds like olive-bellied sunbird as well. But moving into the park, one of the tactics we have is to go and stake out some of these quiet forest ponds, which are much further into the park. And to get there, we'll take a four-wheel drive vehicle. It's Ankasa is there's basically one road. It used to be the old road to Ivory Coast that runs straight through the center of the park. So if you've got a four-wheel drive vehicle, you can go right far deep into the park. And we'll sit and wait very quietly at these ponds. And it's a really nice place to try and find some of the rarer kingfisher species, forest kingfishers, things like shining blue kingfisher, white-bellied kingfisher, dwarf kingfisher, and pygmy kingfisher. But not only birds, but also it's possible to find West African dwarf crocodile, which I believe is now critically endangered elsewhere. But they are there's a healthy population in this particular pond, which is really nice to see. Again, it's just a nice bonus. And then around the edge of the lake, if you sit very patiently and quietly at dusk, it's possible to see things like forest duikers, come for a drink. But it's actually after dark that the mammals really come to life, and the spotlighting opportunities in Ankasa are fantastic. You've got things like the anomalieurs. They are quite bizarre, a unique family of rodents that are exclusive to both Central and West Africa. But sort of despite their genetic relation, there is no genetic relation at all, really. They bear a very close resemblance to large flying squirrels. There are three species of anomalieur in Ghana. This one is the Lord Derby's anomalieur. The others are Beecroft's and Pell's anomalieur. But it's not only the anomalieurs, of course. There are some nice nocturnal primates as well. So West African potto, plus the two dwarf galago species, or bush babies, as some people like to call them. Plus, you've got some of the rarer inhabitants of the forest as well, things like Western tree hyrax and African palm civet, both of which actually make a very bizarre noise, quite haunting calls, both of them in their own right, but not perhaps quite as bizarre as this, which is the Unkulenku rail. Again, very, very bizarre bird, very difficult to see elsewhere. In fact, Ankasa is probably, again, one of the best locations to have a shot at finding this species. And their call is so bizarre. I just want to try and play you some now. Hopefully this works for you, but I'm just going to play a couple of seconds so you can hear what it sounds like. So they're actually named Unkulenku after that call, Unkulenku, Unkulenku. So that's actually the way we locate them, because they sit very still and they're very, they don't move much, but they can call for up to sort of a minute straight. So as soon as they start calling, we'll go, charging through the forest and try and find them. So that's, it's really exciting when you start to hear that call. But in the region, of course, you've got some, as I mentioned, you've got some excellent diurnal primates. Although they can be quite skittish, there are a couple of reserves, like Biobang femur, which is where I took this photo, for Upper Guinea endemics like Lowe's monkey, but also critically endangered species as well, like white-thighed colobus or Joffrey's colobus. Absolutely stunning primate and yeah, sadly very, very endangered. And yeah, like Ben was saying earlier, some of these animals are really under threat now, and things like chimpanzees sadly just aren't really seen in the region anymore. So yeah, it's nice that there are some reserves like this which still have a strong population that are very well protected. If you do have time, it's well worthwhile extending your holiday to go north. Up in the north, you've got a distinctly drier habitat. It's more scrub and savanna up by Mole National Park. And you've also got what is Ghana's premier eco lodge. So this is Zana Lodge, and this is the view from just above the infinity pool down to the private waterhole, where there are some African savanna elephants having a cool off. And as I mentioned, this is a park where you can see some of the more typical fauna that you might expect to see in East Africa. So you've got, African savanna elephants, lots of warthogs and waterbuck and things like that, but also some more quirky mammals as well. Roan antelope, hartebeest, western cob, red-flanked duiker, even some things like Kintampo rope squirrel, which is recently described and only really confined to this area. So there are some really, really cool stuff to look for as well. And one of my favorite things about Mole, and in fact Ghana's national parks in general, is that you're absolutely fine to explore on foot, with a ranger, of course. Which means it's possible to get within meters sometimes of some of this wildlife, including elephants. And they're very tolerant of people here. So you can get some really special moments if you're lucky. The nocturnal viewing as well is very good in Mole, particularly for some of the things you can't necessarily see elsewhere. So Pardine genet is a species of genet that's kind of, restricted to this area of Africa. And actually one of our tailor-made clients earlier this year even found an aardvark. So there is, you never know what's going to turn up on some of these night drives. And I always love going out at nighttime for that reason. The open country birding, as I touched on earlier, is again fantastic, and you've got a different array of birds here, which you're not going to necessarily find in the rainforest belt. Things like African grey hornbill, but also red-throated bee-eater, and also northern carmine bee-eater, which I showed earlier, some stunning species. And there's also a reliable location near the Volta River, which is not so far from Mole National Park, for Egyptian plover, which is among one of the most sought after waders in the world, and for good reason. It's very attractive, and this spot is quite reliable for them as well. So you can go and see that as well. In these dry zones, you've got different kind of primates to the ones you find in the rainforest belt. So you've got the tantalus monkey, which lives down actually in the south of the country in Shy Hills, and up in the north of the country, the species is green monkey, which is slightly different. And I just needed to include this photo because I think this is one of the coolest looking bats in the world. This is a yellow-winged bat, and they can be found as well quite easily in Mole National Park if you look under in congregations of bushes around dried watercourses. These guys can be found hanging upside down during the daytime. Yeah, they're fabulous looking creatures, so I thought I'd have to show you those as well. And as I mentioned earlier, reptiles too. There's a nice array of reptiles in Ghana. Things like Peter's rockagama are absolutely everywhere. But we also actually encountered things like forest cobra as well, which we didn't expect. And that's a fabulous snake. Any herpetologists amongst you, certainly friends of mine that are herpetologists, were very jealous of us encountering that particular species as well. So just to sort of wrap up a little bit, Ben's already gone into a lot of detail on the 8 species. And as he touched upon as well, yes, we do run tours to countries where you could theoretically encounter pretty much all of these species. However, again, as we've mentioned, outside of the 2 mentioned in this presentation, your chances are pretty slim to none, to be completely honest. However, if you are really interested and really dedicated, as Ben said, particularly if you'd like to do a tailor-made tour, we can arrange to have a go at trying to find ground pangolin or Temminck's pangolin. As Ben mentioned, there's a couple of research projects in the Kalahari region, northern South Africa and Namibia. But also, as he said, it is very expensive, and the viewing is also not guaranteed. These are still wild animals. Yeah, you could occasionally. I'm very jealous of Ben's encounter. They do occasionally pop up on African safaris, but it's going to be more chance than target, and that's going to be the same story for the others as well. Uh, as Ben touched upon, the Indian pangolin, if you do want to go for that one, it's very occasionally seen on night drives. We offer a Sri Lanka by night tour, and I think our encounter rate, in general, the encounter rate on night safaris in Sri Lanka is about once a month. So that gives you an idea, if that's reliable, that gives you an idea of what reliable means. So again, it's going to be, it'd be happy, a happy time to chance upon them, but you can't realistically expect to see them on any trips, I'm afraid. Sunder pangolin as well, as Ben said, is seen a couple of times a year in Sabah and Borneo. My one of our guides actually messaged me yesterday to say he'd just seen one in Duramakot Forest Reserve, and unfortunately our Naturetrek group missed it by about 5 minutes, which would have been absolutely gutting for them. But so yeah, again, you could chance upon them, but they are incredibly, incredibly rare. But with that, I think I'm going to wrap up, and we'll now sort of open the floor to Q&A. So if we do have questions, we'll go ahead and answer those now. But actually, before we get into that, Ben, if there was one species that you haven't seen in the wild that you'd really like to see, which species of pangolin would you most like to go for?
Well, thanks, George. Great. I really enjoyed your presentation, by the way. Well, I think it's so hard to choose. They're all so fascinating. I've been very lucky to see two of them so far. I would happily see either of those species again, ground pangolin or black-bellied. They're both charismatic and fantastic. If I had to pick one, it would be giant pangolin, though. The biggest species found in these remote forests. It's a bit of a ghost, even in some of the best protected areas in tropical kind of rainforest Africa. But it's a hard decision, and I wouldn't be picky. If someone offered me any of the 8 species, I would snap their hand off.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm probably the same. That'd be an absolutely awesome creature to come across. But yeah, maybe one day. I myself have been to Gabon in the right kind of habitat, but yeah, unfortunately, no sighting for us either. Okay, great. So if we come to some of the questions, thank you all for posting them into the chat. So we've got a question from Kit Sheffield here. Kit says, did pangolins evolve scales as defense against predation or as a defense against ant and termite bites or for something else?
Yeah, so really good question. It seems like predator defense was a major reason for why they did evolve, and when you see them being confronted with predators, you can see it's a very effective adaptation for deterring predators. There are some intriguing other possibilities, though. So there's a suggestion that actually the pangolins might, in part, have evolved these scales to replace part of their immune system. So if you think an animal that has all these hard scales covering its body, it's very rare that that animal is actually going to get its skin cut. And that means that by having these scales, they are much less vulnerable to bacterial and other kinds of infections. And an immune system is a very demanding thing for an animal to run. So if you can basically slow down your immune system for any reason, that's going to enable you to devote many more resources to things that could otherwise improve your chances of survival. So it's thought that those scales actually replace part of the immune system for the pangolin too, which I think, as far as I'm aware, is a unique situation amongst any mammals. But yeah, great question.
Sure. Yeah, that does make sense. I actually didn't know that. Yeah, that's a very good point. Another question from Kit as well. Was it from Kit? I'm sorry if I had already done that. I think we mentioned that the butterfly tour is not showing up under Ghana. We thank you for noticing that and pointing that out. We'll sort that out. So it should be under butterfly tours, but apparently it's not currently appearing under Ghana. We'll fix that tomorrow, and hopefully it will be showing correctly. I believe there'll be an e-news coming out as well soon, which will have a link to that tour as well. Thank you very much for pointing that one out. That's great. And also Caroline Woodall has asked has said that both our pangolin trips this year are full, and if there's any chance of having an extra trip this year. I think it's probably unlikely, but certainly we can ask Barney Jones, who's our operations manager for our group tours to Ghana. We do have spaces on next year's 2025 February trips if you would be able to hold off until then. But if not, of course, then we'd be more than happy to do a tailor-made for you as well, if that's something you consider. Then we don't need to be restricted by dates necessarily, and we can customize the trip entirely, to your liking. So that's something to consider as well, if you weren't able to get on those November trips. Great. So another question here. This one's from Mary Rowe, and she makes a very good point here. If pangolins don't survive well in captivity, how can they be farmed?
Yeah, well, I mean, Mary, you've hit the nail on the head. The answer is that they can't, and that this is all a complete fabrication, basically, on the part of the Chinese government. So no independent expert thinks that pangolins can be, they can barely even be reared in captivity properly, let alone farmed on the kind of scale that you'd need to meet the demand for their products. It is easier, it seems, to keep Asian species in captivity than African ones, and that may be because we think they're a little bit more flexible in the kinds of insect species they're willing to eat. So I know of some rehabilitation centers that are able to successfully feed pangolins, at least for a short time, on some of the kind of commercial insects that you can buy for like pet reptiles and other sort of exotic pets. But the reality is that pangolins are very vulnerable to stress, and they're very vulnerable to yeah, all sorts of other things that are associated with life in captivity. And there are also practically no examples of second generation pangolins being bred in captivity. So there are examples of two wild caught pangolins being bred in captivity, but there's basically no evidence that you can keep their offspring in captivity well enough that they reach breeding condition themselves. And of course, one of the key things you've got to do if you're going to be farming something is you've got to be able to cut off the wild source. You have to not be reliant on constantly importing more and more animals from the wild. So yeah, so in reality, they cannot be farmed. They certainly can't be farmed on the scale that would be needed to meet demand for their scales. So it's a no-go. It's a dead end from a conservation perspective, and we should all make efforts to try and make sure people are aware that that's the case. Because otherwise, I think what the Chinese government are trying to do is they're trying to use this ruse to cover illegal activity and deflect some of the negative attention that they really deserve to be getting.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. A question from Pata here. The forest cobra. Yes. No, it was not in Mole. It was actually over in the Picathartes forest. So we found one quite sizable individual in the Picathartes forest, and a second individual which actually most of the group missed. It was found by one of our local trackers, and that was in Quabina Sam forest, which is 20 minutes, half an hour from Picathartes forest. So yeah, they were both in that forest area. We also had a puff adder in Mole, which is really nice. It's my first puff adder that I've seen in the wild. There was also another species that we were unable to identify. It disappeared quite quickly. It could have been a green mamba, but it wasn't clear enough for us to call it, unfortunately. So yeah, there are some nice reptiles for sure over in Ghana. Yeah. Okay, great. So please, guys, if you do have any questions that we haven't answered so far, please feel free to pop those in the chat, or alternatively, if you do have any questions that you want to follow up on after the talks, you can always email us at Naturetrek or call into the office, and yeah, we'll be more than happy to help you with those. But thank you all so much for tuning in. Thanks to Ben as well. It's been great to hear from you, and yes, wish everyone a fantastic evening. We'll be back on the 29th of May. Ben will be back, actually, I should say, talking about his wild dog project, but also my colleague Jan from TaylorMade will also be talking about Botswana and sort of the wildlife highlights there as well. So that should be a great evening if you're able to join us. So until then, thank you all very much for joining. Thank you all for your lovely comments, and we'll see you next time. Okay,
Thank you, everyone.
thanks, guys.
Good night.